All right, let's dive right into what is, probably one of the oldest and toughest questions for anyone who believes in God. I mean, this is a challenge that really cuts to the core of faith and reason, and it's something that thinkers have wrestled with for literally centuries. So here it is, the big one. If God is all good and all powerful, why is there so much evil in the world? This is what philosophers call the problem of evil. And it makes sense, right? If a god is totally good, he'd want to stop all the bad stuff. And if he's all powerful, he'd be able to. So what gives? Why does all this suffering still happen? That's the massive question we're digging into. Okay, so to really get a handle on the answers, we first have to understand that philosophers don't just lump this all together as one big problem. Nope. They actually split the question into two different kinds of problems. And this distinction is, well, it's everything. On one hand, you've got the logical problem. This one's an all or nothing kind of deal. It says that having a good God and having any evil at all is a flat out logical contradiction, like it's impossible, kind of like a married bachelor. It just can't work. Then you have the evidential problem. This one's a bit different. It's not saying it's impossible, but it's looking at the sheer amount of suffering in the world and saying, wow, with this much horror, a good God seems, well, super unlikely. This logical problem isn't new at all. It has really ancient roots, famously laid out by the Greek philosopher Epicurus. And his paradox just puts it so clearly, doesn't it? It's like a puzzle. You've got God's power, God's goodness, and the reality of evil, and it feels like you can only pick two. So this ancient question gets a modern makeover in the 20th century. A philosopher named J.L. Mackie really zeroed in on that Epicurean paradox, pushing it as a hard logical contradiction. But then, a bit later, William Rowe kind of shifted the whole conversation. He started focusing more on the evidence, all the suffering that seems totally pointless, to argue that a good God probably just doesn't exist. And one more key distinction we gotta make is between the two types of evil. First, there's moral evil. That's pretty straightforward. It's the terrible stuff people choose to do to each other. Murder, theft, you name it. Then there's natural evil. This comes from things that aren't anyone's fault, like earthquakes, diseases, or that famous example William Rowe used, a fawn dying all alone in a forest fire, suffering that just seems to have no reason at all. All right, so now we get to a major turning point in this whole debate. I'm talking about the work of a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga. His answer to that logical problem, well, it completely changed the entire conversation. So Plantinga puts forward this really powerful idea called the free will defense. It tackles that logical problem head on. Here's how it goes. He says, look, God wanted to create creatures with genuine free will. But for freedom to be real, you have to have the option to choose wrong, to choose evil. I mean, otherwise, we'd just be robots, right? And Plantinga's point is that a world with truly free people, even with the risk of evil, is way more valuable than a world full of pre-programmed puppets. So for God, the value of that freedom was worth the risk. And honestly, this argument was a total game changer. It was so effective that the vast majority of philosophers, including atheists like William Rowe, the guy with the fawn example, had to admit, okay, you're right. God and evil aren't a logical contradiction after all. And just like that, the whole debate shifted away from what's impossible to arguing about what's merely improbable. So with that big philosophical argument sort of handled, the Christian response takes a really interesting turn. It pivots from this abstract philosophical defense to something way more personal and theological. It's less about a logical puzzle and more about a claim about what happened in history. See, the heart of the Christian response isn't some neat little formula that explains away every single bit of pain. Far from it. Instead, the claim is that God didn't stay up in the clouds, distant and detached. It claims he came down and entered directly into the mess and the suffering of the human experience. And the claim is that through the person of Jesus, God experienced the whole spectrum of human suffering firsthand. We're talking about being a social outcast, feeling grief when a friend dies, being rejected and treated unjustly, all the way to physical torture, hunger, and even death itself. This wasn't just symbolic. The idea is that it was a real, full participation in our pain. There's this quote from the theologian Dennis Nagian that just captures it perfectly. He says, the cross revealed the only accurate picture of God the world has ever seen. See, the point is, this isn't some God who's just a spectator, watching our pain from a safe distance. No, this is a God who, according to Christianity, willingly wears the scars of our world. Okay, but now some thinkers take this even a step further and do something really bold. They completely flip the original problem of evil on its head. Get this, they argue that the very fact that we can get outraged about evil might actually be evidence for God, not against him. This is called the moral argument, and the logic is pretty fascinating. When we see something and say, that is truly evil, we're not just saying, I don't like that. We're appealing to some kind of objective standard of goodness, right? A standard that exists outside of our own opinions. Well, the argument goes, where could an objective standard like that come from? It has to come from a source beyond us, something that believers would call God or a moral lawgiver. This whole idea rests on a classic understanding of what evil even is. It says that evil isn't a thing in itself, like a rock or a tree that God created. Instead, evil is a lack, a corruption of something good. The analogy is perfect. Rust isn't a thing, it's the absence of the metal's integrity. Sickness isn't a thing, it's the absence of health. In the same way, evil is the absence of good. And this brings us to the complete reversal of the problem. Follow the logic. If there's no God, there's no objective standard for good. And if there's no objective good, then there can't be any real objective evil. It's all just opinion. So the argument is, the very anger you feel at real injustice might be a clue that there's something more than just a material world out there. All right, let's get to the final piece of the puzzle here and see how this all wraps up in the central message of Christianity, what's called the gospel. So the gospel message doesn't pretend suffering isn't real. In fact, it starts there. It says, number one, yeah, the world is broken and evil is real. But then two, God didn't leave us in it. He stepped into it through Jesus. 3, Christ's death is presented as the payment for all that brokenness. And finally, 4, his resurrection is the ultimate proof that death and evil don't get the last word. And it's a promise of a future where all of it is finally gone for good. So you see, the really crucial point here is that in the story, God takes the absolute worst thing humanity can do, the ultimate act of injustice and humiliation on the cross, and somehow turns it into the very thing that saves us. It's all about this incredible reversal, bringing purpose out of tragedy, exaltation out of humiliation, and life out of death. And that's really the final takeaway. In the end, Christianity doesn't offer a tidy philosophical trick to escape the reality of pain. That's not the point. What it offers is something much more personal, a savior who has suffered, and a promise of a future restoration. It's not so much a simple answer as it is a deep and abiding hope.